Ann Tredevick, and welcome to today's first Sunday presentation for Braving the Weather. Glad you're here. I am going to introduce our speaker in just a minute, but just to remind you, this is our monthly series on the first Sundays from October through May. And we come with a variety of topics, issues that concern us every day in our lives as just human beings, but also particularly in our faith, as we walk in our faith journey through our lives. We're very appreciative that we have recordings of these presentations that are on Elam's website, all of the recordings since COVID. So remember when we had lockdown and we couldn't come to church, and our church spent money and they got resources together. People like Landon here, who is a junior at Armstrong High School, who's a volunteer and comes and does this recording with us. And then we have it edited and put up onto our website, YouTube, as well as our website. Please refer back to look and see all the other wonderful presentations that are there. And let your neighbors know who might be interested, or your faraway relatives too. Please silence your phones because it is a recording. And to introduce our speaker today, he was introduced in church. So I'm going to tell you the interesting things that you didn't hear about Reverend Cody Sanders, who is a professor at Luther Seminary. So he and I chatted a few minutes before he got into church, and he's only been in Minnesota for 2 winters now. This is his second winter. He's from Boston and other places around the country, actually. So give him all your winter tips that you want, because he's got it. He loves it. He says he loves winter, so we'll see how he didn't really have a winter last year. We'll see how it goes this year, because last year was not winter for Minnesota. The other thing from his bio that I think is pretty interesting, he was playing church at 6 years old in a backyard chapel built by his father and grandfather at his childhood home in South Carolina, wearing a tiny robe and a stole made by his grandmother. He began nurturing his faith with a deep and abiding love for the church at that point. He takes delight in every opportunity to share with congregations in preaching, worship, leadership, and teaching. He is here today to talk to us about that, as he mentioned, LGBTQ and a Living Understanding Basic 101. But he will also be back in February first Sunday to talk about the new emerging trends in death care. Correct? It's very titled. It'll be very fascinating. He's written a book, co-wrote a book, and I have a copy of it with me today in my bag. But it's called Corpse Care, and it's going to be a really interesting conversation as well. And you might even have copies.
I don't have copies,
but I
was at the American Academy of Religion and Society of Biblical Literature last weekend, and my publisher had these little cards with Corpse Care and my upcoming book, Spiritual Care First Aid, and a 30% off code. So I took some of them. You could have them in case you wanted a copy of the book before next time. You could get one at a major.
We'll keep those if you have extras. We'll make sure. But I've actually read this book, and I found it fascinating. Some people might think that's kind of weird to think corpse care would be interesting, but I find it really interesting, and I think the conversation we have in February will be a fascinating one for us. So please, thank you for your being here with us.
It's really good to be here with you. This is the kind of forum that I do with a lot of churches around the Twin Cities, but also around the country. Churches that are trying to figure out what it means to be a welcoming and affirming place of belonging for LGBTQ people. I want to start with just a little more of my bio so you know who I am and who's talking with you this morning, and feel free to ask other questions about who I am that would make you more comfortable entering into this conversation. So I grew up in South Carolina, in a little town where all of my family had been living for generations. in a little Southern Baptist church where all my family belonged. I'm not sure I even knew where a Lutheran church was when I was growing up, because everyone I knew was Baptist. I had heard that there were some Methodists in town too, but mostly we were all Baptists. And I grew up in this little Baptist church, loving the church because of the music. I loved the music of the choir and the organ. I used to tell my peers in elementary school when I was 5 or 6 years old that I wanted to be a church organist when I grew up. And I did eventually take organ lessons and learn to play the organ. But loved going to church, loved church so much that I did beg my dad and grandfather, who were contractors, to build me a little church in my backyard, which they did. It had a stained glass window in it from our real church's basement. My grandfather built a little steeple. My grandmother sewed me that robe and stole. My other grandfather came up after school every day and played church with me in the backyard with some neighbor kids. So I grew up loving the church, being nurtured by the church. My budding sense of call to ministry was being nurtured by this church in some really beautiful ways. And it was the elders of the church, the elderly women who taught 2nd, 3rd grade, and 4th grade Sunday school, who really loved me and nurtured my sense of call at that early age. And I knew at that very early age, and later in elementary and in middle school, that there was something about my attraction to other boys that probably made me different, but I didn't really know what to make of that, because I'd never heard anybody talk about that before, same-sex attraction. And probably, fortunately, no one in my church, people didn't preach about homosexuality back then in that congregation. If they had, it probably would have been a pretty negative message, so probably fortunate that I didn't hear a lot about it. But it also meant that I was growing up with this emerging sense of sexuality that I had no language for. And intuitively, I knew that it would be a problem if I brought this into conversation with people, so I was trying to figure this out on my own for a really long time. Even into college, I was not talking about this with anyone else. I was pursuing this call to vocation in ministry, and also trying to figure out how my sexuality and my faith would fit together, what to make of that as I was growing into ministry. So later on, when I was in seminary and was beginning to come out, found a church that had been ordaining LGBTQ people for many, many years. It was a real breath of fresh air for me to be in a place where I knew my place at the table as a member of this congregation, as someone in the ordination process, was not in question. That this church fully embraced me as a queer Baptist and soon-to-be queer Baptist minister. After seminary, after being ordained there at Oakhurst Baptist Church, I went on to do a PhD at Brown University School at TCU in Fort Worth. And I knew I wanted to study LGBTQ issues in pastoral care and counseling. And one of the reasons is I wanted there to be better resources for churches, for ministers, for seminarians, to prepare them for more robustly affirming ministry for LGBTQ people who were growing up in those churches when they were going to serve someday. So early on, one of the first books that I wrote after finishing my PhD was a book called A Brief Guide to Ministry with LGBTQIA Youth. It was just a very short book that I thought ministers, youth volunteer workers, etc. could read as sort of a crash course, the basics that you really needed to know about sexuality, about gender identity, and about the various things that LGBTQ youth face in our society. We'll get a little more into that in the presentation. But let me stop there to see if there are any more questions that you want to ask about who I am and where I'm coming from in this presentation that would help you feel more comfortable in this conversation. Anything you want to know? All right, there'll be more times for questions. Sometimes when I do this presentation in churches, we don't get past the first or second slide because there are so many questions. And if that happens, that's perfectly fine. There often aren't a lot of places where people feel comfortable asking all the questions they have about LGBTQ experiences. So I want you to be able to ask those questions here.
So, here you mentioned this, and I worry that if we have questions at the beginning, we won't get to the end. And I'm curious about the whole presentation. So how long are your formal remarks?
It varies. You won't get to the end of this. There's way too much in this slide deck for us. So we'll get through the basics and then we'll see where we go from there.
I'm wondering if people would be willing to jot down their questions and then we could save time at the end.
I'd rather have a conversation.
You want a
It's
conversation?
a better
Okay.
style of learning. So
Okay.
yeah.
Well,
I do it every week, so let me just do it the way I do it.
We'll have to have you come back another time
Yeah.
if we don't get very far.
So just going over some terminology, because this is some of the stuff that people get a little confused about. They don't know what all the words mean, and they're not sure what words to use for what experiences. So the first sort of bucket, this terminological category, is sexual and affectional orientation or identity. So sexual orientation or affectional orientation is about who you're attracted to. Affectional is a word that's being added or used instead of sexual orientation sometimes because, of course, our attraction to other people is about more than our sexual attraction to other people. It's about our attraction to them as a whole person, our romantic attractions, our emotional attractions. The second big identity category bucket of terminology I want to talk a little bit about is gender identity and expression. This is about how we perceive our own sense of gender. And we'll get into the spectrum in that in just a little bit. What terms do you know already that fit in that sexual affectional orientation category?
Transgender?
That one fits into the gender identity category. Thanks for naming that. We'll definitely get to transgender. Any term?
Gay.
Gay,
Straight?
straight,
Lesbian.
lesbian,
Bisexual.
bisexual. Those are pretty much the major ones you hear most often. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, asexual, which is an orientation that hasn't gotten a lot of attention until recently. And asexuality basically means someone who doesn't experience sexual attraction, period. That doesn't mean they don't want an intimate relationship, emotional relationship, romantic partnership, but it means they don't really experience sexual attraction to either men or women or anyone else. Pansexual is another term that's emerging to mean sort of sexual attraction beyond the male-female binary, attraction that is experienced broadly, much more broadly than we've often been able to talk about it. Demisexual is a term you might hear used among younger generations, which is a term that means someone needs to feel a deep emotional connection to someone before they feel a sexual attraction to that person. And I put et cetera there because there are so many other words that could go in this category. And what I want you to hear is if you hear someone using a term that you don't know or you don't understand, it's okay to say, I've never heard the term demisexual, and I'm really curious what that means for you. Just very respectfully, very honestly, with compassionate curiosity, ask about the terms that you don't understand. Any questions about this category of identity markers, these terms at this point? Yeah.
I don't think of the term queer, which is used frequently today.
Yeah.
In my generation, that was a pejorative.
Yeah.
And when I hear the word used today, it does kind of make me flinch a little because it's an insult. No, it's a definition.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I think there's a lot of terminology that we use differently back then.
That's a really
very common usage today.
Yeah, that's a great point. Queer is a term that's coming back into usage as a sort of unifying umbrella category or term that contains a lot of things underneath it. The queer is not exactly an identity marker or an orientation. It can mean a lot of different things, and it is used by LGBTQIA people often just to talk about the broad community of people. But it comes from a place of pejorative usage, a term that in your generation was used to use disparagingly against people. insult. And one of the really, I think, beautiful things about many LGBTQ communities is that they've been able to take back things that were meant to harm them and to use them as terms of unification, like queer. So you might hear queer described, like I often say, I'm a queer Baptist minister. That doesn't necessarily tell you a lot about my sexual orientation or my gender identity, but it sort of includes me in this broad category of people who don't necessarily understand our sexualities as straight or our gender identity as cisgender or something like that. That's a great point. Now, under the gender identity and expression category, what terms do you know that fit under there? You've already said transgender. Yeah.
Non-binary?
Non-binary. Yeah.
Cisgender.
Cisgender. Good. Cisgender. Anyone know what cisgender means? Do you know?
You identify as the sex you were called at birth.
Exactly. Yeah, you identify as the sex you were assigned at birth. So when you were born and the doctor looks at you and says to your parents, it's a girl, if you identify as a female, then you are cisgender. You might not have even known you were cisgender before you showed up here today, but that describes your sense of gender, the alignment between your gender assigned at birth or sex assigned at birth, and how you actually experience your gender. And cisgender is the identity category that you might use. Transgender, trans, so meaning the sex you were assigned at birth is not the gender that you actually identify with. So the doctor may have said, it's a girl to your parents because all of the markers, exterior markers at least, suggested that. But as you grow up, you don't identify as a woman. You might come to identify yourself as more masculine and really identify as a boy early on. That would be a trans man, so someone who identifies as a man but is transgender. Same for a woman. If the doctor said it's a boy, but you grow up really feeling that you are a girl, that's trans woman. Genderqueer is another kind of category that defies categories in some ways. It doesn't really suggest one particular thing about a person's gender identity. It just suggests that they don't identify with this male-female binary. That binary is too constricting. So genderqueer or agender, again, not identifying with either gender. Gender fluid might mean that someone moves between a masculine and a feminine presentation of their gender, or even a masculine and feminine experience of their gender. Any others that I missed?
Does transgender include people who simply identify as the other sex and people who physically change them?
Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, transgender includes people who identify as the opposite sex that they were assigned at birth, whether or not they have hormone treatments or gender affirmation surgery or anything like that. It describes their sense of their own gender. But many people do then seek medical treatment to get hormone replacement therapy or to have surgery to remove breasts or other gender affirmation surgeries to actually make their bodies align with their own sense of gender. And that would still be called transgender. So to identify as transgender doesn't really say a lot about where you are in that kind of spectrum. And many people live, I recall a woman I knew in another church in another state who was probably in her 70s when I knew her, and was just beginning to publicly transition. Meaning she would come to church dressed as a woman, and she was presenting publicly as a woman. That's called gender presentation. But she had known she was transgender all of her adult life, but in that state, and still in many states, she would have lost her job if she identified openly as transgender or presented as a woman. So it wasn't until she retired and didn't have the threat of losing her job that she even began to present publicly as her gender. So yes, transgender includes all of those experiences.
So you're saying that if someone's a man and they dress up like a woman, that doesn't necessarily mean they have to identify as a woman, they can still identify as a man?
Cross-dressing.
Well, that's a good question. I mean, cross-dressing, so there's a lot of different ways in which cross-dressing takes place. So like this person I'm describing did identify as a trans woman. It's just that all of her life she could not be open about that until she was retired. But cross-dressing can take place for a lot of different reasons. For example, drag shows, a form of entertainment which involves cross-dressing, men dressing as women, women dressing as men. That doesn't necessarily say anything about that person's gender identity. That is a performative act of gender. So yeah, there could be reasons that someone would present as the other gender, but not actually be transgender for some reasons like that. Any other questions in this gender identity category?
I don't know if it fits in this category, but there's this whole spectrum of mannerisms and behaviors.
Yeah.
You talk about a woman having mannish
Mm-hmm.
behaviors, or men who are femmy, I guess. That doesn't necessarily mean they're gay.
Right, yeah.
It's just a matter of their physical, neurological makeup.
Yeah.
So where do you go with that?
Well, that would be, sort of a gender presentation or gender expression. And there are, I think, more and more, especially in younger generations, people who question the socialization of gender that we are presented. Like men have to be this way, not show emotion, dress like this, et cetera, et cetera. Women have to be this way. And those categories are breaking down for people because we can see how they are socially constructed categories that don't really have anything to do with our actual experience of gender. And so I think there are more people who are pushing gender expression barriers that in earlier times would have maybe made them targets of discrimination or even violence. But, men who wear clothes that we might think of as more feminine clothing, but don't identify as transgender. So the categories I think about gender are being blurred in a whole lot of different ways, which does create more room, more space for people to actually express their gender in ways beyond this very dichotomous binary male and female. Yeah.
Is someone's sex the same thing as their gender, or are those different things?
That's a good question. So sex usually means the sex you were assigned at birth and has to do with anatomical and genetic markers. Gender usually refers to your own social, psychological, spiritual experience of gender. So like I said, if you are born and the doctor looks at your anatomy and says it's a girl, that doesn't mean that's the sex assigned at birth. That doesn't necessarily mean that person is going to grow up feeling their gender as female. It gets even more complicated when we talk about the anatomical ways in which people are born ambiguously. For example, I think we know more about instances when an intersex person is born with ambiguous genitalia, where the doctor doesn't quite know just by looking at the baby's genitalia whether it's boy or girl. And that happens so many more times than we know. And up until recent days, what has typically happened is that the doctor and the parents decide which gender it's going to be. And then surgical interventions are done to create the exterior genitalia for that gender. And that has typically been really harmful for intersex people because growing up, they may not even know that they were born intersex and may not know why they feel this sort of tension between the gender that they were told they are and the gender they actually experience. So many times those decisions are being delayed a little bit more now. But there's another way in which someone can be born intersex that has nothing to do with the external genitalia. Someone can come out of the womb, look like a boy or look like a girl very clearly, but their genetic markers are actually not XX or XY. So genetically, they might have XX Y chromosomes, or I can't remember all the different combinations, XXY and things of this nature, that they don't know about until sometime later in their life when, for example, they might experience some problems getting pregnant. Then they go to their doctor, they do some genetic testing, and realize that they were born with genetic markers that were not male or female, but there's nothing externally that would have indicated that. So this intersex category, which also goes into this gender identity expression category, is someone who is born with either physical anatomical ambiguity or genetic differences that you can't even perceive at birth.
Is that anthropomorphic? I can't think of the word that, I'm thinking of Jeffrey Eugenides' book, Middlesex.
Androgynous.
Androgynous?
Okay, yes, thank you.
That's a term that's been used in the past for that. It's not used quite as much anymore, but yeah, that's what that, yeah. Mhm. Yeah, very good. So the acronym, which many people get a little tripped up on because it's growing and growing and growing. LGBTQIA2S+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual. Now you know what those terms mean. 2S, it means two-spirit, which is a Native American category of gender that is a very long history of Native American tribes in North America, where they recognized that some people defied this binary of male and female. And often, in many Native American tribes in the US or in America, those people were honored in their communities as special, yes. Not discriminated against, actually elevated as special in their communities. So two-spirit, and then plus is just for all of the ways in which there are so many more terms that we couldn't possibly fit into an acronym. And I want you to hear that even though it's confusing because it keeps growing, it is a really, really good thing that language proliferates in this way. Because for a long time, gay, lesbian, transgender people have had our experience named for us, usually by the medical psychiatric establishment, the legal jurisprudence kind of establishment, or the ecclesial establishment, the church. And in all three of those areas, our experience has been, in medical psychiatric establishment, pathologized. Homosexuality was invented as a medical term and was in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders until 1973.
73.
Yeah, so that was not a term we chose for ourselves. That was a term that doctors and psychiatrists applied to our experience. But just like you said with queer, gay, lesbian people picked that up and used it as an identity marker and as a marker of pride, even though it wasn't a term that we came up with. The legal jurisprudence establishment has typically criminalized our behaviors in ways that, many states have had laws that criminalize same-sex sexuality, and now we're seeing a whole proliferation of laws, which we'll get to in another slide, that is criminalizing gender identity and the expression of gender identity in many places. We'll get to that in a minute. And of course, the ecclesial establishment has often called our experiences of gender and sexuality sinful. So the fact that LGBTQIA2S+ people are being able to name for ourselves our experiences that are beyond the labels that have been applied to us is a sign of liberation. It's a sign that we are actually being able to say things about our lives that the medical establishment, the legal establishment, the church never really understood. So though it may be frustrating that this acronym keeps growing, I invite you to see it as a sign of liberation. I want to tell you a story, actually, that I think is also very helpful. The story of LGBTQ ecclesial liberation. This is a story of the first time that LGBTQ people ever established a church for LGBTQ people. And it happened like this. There was a small Catholic parish with a small group of gay and lesbian people who were members of this parish And these gay and lesbian people had told their priest about their sexual experience, their sexual orientation, presumably in hopes of having some kind of dialogue about their faith and sexuality. This was the priest's response to that admission of their sexuality. Every week, as the congregation approached the altar rail for communion, and they would kneel at the altar rail to receive the host, when the priest would come to one of the gay or lesbian parishioners, he would pass them over and serve the next person. And every week that happened. He would be serving the communion and get to one of the gay and lesbian parishioners, pass them over, serve the next person. Obviously, this was really upsetting to the LGBT people in the congregation and to many of the straight people in the congregation who saw what was happening and knew what was going on. So this small group of lesbian and gay parishioners left this Catholic parish, along with some of their straight friends, and they went down the street and rented space in a hotel lounge. And they pulled together 2 cocktail tables into a makeshift altar. And they began what became known as the Eucharistic Catholic Church, named for the very element of their faith that was denied them. And this was the first time LGBT people had ever come together to form a church for the inclusion and belonging of LGBTQ people. And I often ask people where they think this happened and when. Usually people guess in the 60s or 70s, like somewhere around the Stonewall riot era, or maybe the 80s, 90s, when the AIDS epidemic. They usually guess New York, San Francisco, or LA. All good guesses, big hubs of LGBTQ activism. But the Eucharistic Catholic Church started in 1946 in Atlanta, Georgia. And it started as a place where Catholics and Protestants and anyone who didn't belong to a religious tradition could belong. It started as a place for gay and lesbian people and straight people to belong. And in 1946, Atlanta, Georgia, the Eucharistic Catholic Church began as a racially integrated congregation. Isn't that an incredible story? This is the kind of story that I think churches need to hear about LGBTQ people, because we have these stories within this broad story of faith that are being forgotten and lost and not passed on. And this is the kind of story that LGBTQ people growing up in churches need to hear, because we don't have any conduits, any kind of natural conduits to receive the stories of our ancestors. If you grew up as in a particular racial group, you grew up as a black kid in a black family, you have some conduit to hear the stories of black people in the country from your family. If you grow up a particular nationality, as Somali American in Minnesota, you have a natural conduit through your family to have your stories passed on to you, to not lose the stories of your ancestors. But gay and lesbian people and transgender people, we come to know ourselves usually in families that don't have other gay, lesbian, and transgender people necessarily. And we're cut off from our stories in ways that I think do us harm, because we often, like I did, come to an awareness of our sexuality thinking maybe we're the only person who's ever experienced this before. And it's a very isolating kind of experience. So any ways that you can learn these stories and pass them on to people. I heard that story from a queer religious historian named Heather Rachel White, and she has a fabulous book called Reforming Sodom, which is a really great history of LGBTQ organizing in religious spaces in the US. There's another site that you might be interested in, a website called Q Spirit. There's a woman named Kitteridge Cherry, and she collects stories of LGBTQ saints through the ages and puts them on her website. There's a Facebook page and everything to Q Spirit. So lots of places where you can find these. If you want to have any of these resources, just email me. I'll put my email up at the end, and I'll send you anything you might want. Questions before you move on? Yeah.
Did the Catholic Church in general embrace the Eucharistic Church, or Catholics, or deny them, or what did they do?
No, they were never a part of the Roman Catholic Church. It was a sort of breakaway movement. They did eventually get a priest who I assume probably lost his credentials for serving this church, a man named George Hyde. came to serve this church. It continued for many years. It doesn't really exist anymore. There's a church in Canada that sort of traces its lineage back to the Eucharistic Catholic Church, but no, it was never brought into Roman Catholicism. Anything else before we move on? So this is just a little diagram that I think is helpful to further understand the spectrum of biological sex and gender identity and gender expression and gender presentation and sexual orientation. We've talked about this a lot, so I won't get very deeply into it. But if you want to look at this, the Trevor Project is a really, really wonderful website that, well, firstly, the Trevor Project's main role is as a supportive place for LGBTQ youth and young adults who are considering suicide. They have a hotline, they have a chat line, a text line. So it's a place that if there are people in your life, LGBTQ people, who you think might consider suicide as a thinkable option, the Trevor Project is the go-to place for support. But they also have this big research arm, and they do some really wonderful research on the experiences of LGBTQ people, more broadly, and specifically youth in our country. And this is just one of their tools to help people understand that all of these things mean something slightly different. And we all have all of these things. We all have the biological sex that we are assigned at birth, and we all have a gender identity. And those two things, for many of us, align, but for many of us, don't align. We all have a gender expression and a gender presentation. Those are about what you were asking about, Harold, how we present ourselves to the world. Sometimes our gender identity, our gender expression and presentation don't align with our gender identity because we're not in a place that's safe to present our gender as we want to present it. Like the woman I talked about who couldn't come out as transgender until after she was retired and no longer worried about losing her job. And all of those things are distinct and different from sexual orientation, which we also all have. So you may never have considered yourself on all 5 of these different spectrum, I guess. But does this help you make sense somewhat of your own experience of gender and sexuality?
I have a question.
Yeah.
So I'm confused about the gender identity and the social construct piece of your biological sex. So how, there's this continuum of where your parent raises you, you live in a society, you're given pink clothes or blue clothes when you're born and given male or female names. But there's that construct, and then there's that gender identity. So which one is the most influential and which one is, I don't know, lack of a better word, real person? Because could you be comfortable if you were raised in the construct of female? Will you always revert to the default is your essential person? I don't know how you separate out this. How do you tease this out?
Yeah, it's hard to separate these out because they're all intertwining in some ways. But I think that gender identity is the way in which you, as a person, understand your own sense of gender. So to my mind, at least, that's the one that is most deeply held as a personal claim about one's own sense of gender. The gender expression, gender presentation, those are the things that can shift and change depending on your context. So you might have been assigned female at birth, but identify as male, so you'd be a trans man. But you may be in a household that's never allowed you to play with the gender identity, the gender expression and presentation pieces of that. You had, for your own safety and well-being, you had to present as a girl. There was no other option. So you still feel the gender identity of male, but the presentation and expression can't align with that, maybe intuitively. So I think that the identity is the piece that is the one that people claim for themselves, whether or not they're able to express it and present it in their dress, and their mannerisms, and their interests, and their
Can that identity though change as you age? So I think of youth, young
Yeah.
adolescents, where their sexuality is just becoming, they're more aware of it and it's expressing it. And they're curious and love to challenge and take risks. So they're going out, they're doing all kinds of things to
Sure.
understand who they are.
Yeah.
But then maybe that's just a phase. That maybe what they're really still their same identity, but they are in a phase of life where they're just doing all kinds of things to test
Yeah,
boundaries.
They very well could be. And
I
that-
think it's often questioning your own, I mean, wherever you are, questioning your sexual identity.
Sure,
And,
yeah.
you know, you have to change it, but it's a question.
Yeah. And, I think families that allow that kind of gender flexibility in one's presentation, the playfulness with gender, can be really helpful in the child actually coming to understand their gender in an earlier and truer way, rather than expecting them to present in a particular way always because they are a man or whatever. And just to go back to the terminology we talked about on the first slide, there are also people who experience their gender identity as gender queer or gender fluid and would not necessarily identify as a man or a woman. There are some days or some seasons in life where their expression might be much more masculine, some when they might be much more feminine, but their identity is not tied to this binary of male to female. And we talked about this too, anatomically and genetically, that binary is really tenuous because it doesn't always align with those two categories anyway, and never has. And there are many cultures, like many Native American cultures, that have seen and recognized and honored that in ways that we typically have not. Anything else before we move on? So I'm going to talk a little bit about LGBTQ affirming ministry, what it means for a church to be affirming of LGBTQ people. And this can mean a lot of different things for different congregations. I think generally, most denominations who have a category of affirmation, Lutherans call it reconciling, Methodists call it reconciling, Baptists call it welcoming and affirming, UCC call it open and affirming, a lot of different terms. I also want to say that those terms don't mean anything to anybody outside of your denomination. So if you ever put something on your sign to indicate that you're a welcoming place for LGBTQ people, don't put reconciling or open and affirming, because no one knows what that means outside of those denominational traditions. We have to be more forthright in what we mean when we say LGBTQ people are welcome in this place. And usually denominations, when they talk about affirmation, mean that there's no barrier for church leadership, ordination, based on sexuality or gender identity, that same-sex couples can be married in the church just like opposite-sex couples. There's no office or category of leadership that can't be held by an LGBTQ person. And generally that there's some attention to LGBTQ experience, and particularly how that's intersected with faith, and more sensitivity to those kinds of experiences, which can, for many of us, be stressful to traumatic in our growing up years. So I don't know exactly where you would consider yourself to be on that affirmation journey, but I want to talk a little bit about what it means to actually live into a sense of being affirming of LGBTQ people. One, this is the one I've already said, say what you want to say in ways that people can hear it. If you mean LGBTQ people can find a home and a place of belonging here, say that. The church where I was a pastor in Harvard Square in Cambridge, we used the phrase celebrating LGBTQIA lives, because that was really clear. It didn't mean you could belong here, but there were barriers. It didn't mean we are welcoming of LGBTQ people, but only to a certain point. It was really clear that we celebrated the lives and the embodiments of LGBTQ people. And we had, symbols like rainbow flags and the trans flags on our signs and things like that. And I will tell you, we have lots of LGBTQ people in the church, but the majority of the people who came to that church because they saw those signs were straight people. Because they didn't want to go to a church where their brother, when he visited, couldn't go with them. Or they were college students at Harvard, and they didn't want to go to a church where their queer and trans friends couldn't come with them. So this is a symbol not just for LGBTQ people in your community. This is a place where they can belong fully and wholly as themselves. But it's also a symbol for other people in your community who love LGBTQ people and do not want to belong to a church where they can't bring their LGBTQ family members. And often when I give this kind of workshop, I gave a workshop like this at a little campground up in Maine one time. And it was a group of probably mostly octogenarians in this circle. And I asked them why they came to this workshop on LGBTQ youth. And every one of them, my grandson is gay, my daughter is lesbian, my grandson has a gay friend. And they all wanted to understand something about how to honor their children, their grandchildren, their children's friends, and things like that in the fullness of their sexuality and gender identity. So if you get to the point of proclaiming this as a place of belonging for LGBTQ people, just be really clear about what you mean in that so that people can find you. I once interviewed a man for some research I was doing on LGBTQ suicide who had a suicide attempt in his 20s. I was interviewing him when he was 49 years old. He had developed this very rich, robust faith life. Prayer was so deeply important to him. He loved the Bible, even though it had been used against him as a weapon many times. He also had such a rich theological kind of framework. At the end of the interview, I said, Thomas, it sounds like you read a lot of queer theology. And Thomas said, what is queer theology? He didn't know anybody had been writing about this kind of stuff. And he didn't know for 30 years that there were any churches that he could belong to as an open to gay men. And I was interviewing him in a place where within about a 3-mile radius, there were probably at least half a dozen churches that he could have belonged. And he walked by some of them every day, but there was nothing visibly present that indicated to him that these were places he could ever go into. And just that week, the week of our interview, he had stumbled across the big Lutheran church downtown and gone in to ask if he could use their piano to practice. And then talking to the secretary or whoever, he found out it was an affirming church where gay and lesbian people could belong. It was such good news to him. I just think about the good news that would have been for him 10, 20, 30 years ago. So that he didn't have to spend 30 years doing his faith all by himself because he didn't know there were communities that would embrace him. So it's an important one. The one thing that I find a lot of churches who have been affirming for a while often lack is a sense of knowledge and competency related to gender identity. So that's something we've been building here, and you can continue. There's a really wonderful book by a Lutheran author who's actually a graduate of Lutheran Seminary named Austin Hartke called Transforming. And I think that is the best introductory text for trans faith concerns out right now. Transforming by Austin Hartke. And he's local. I think he lives in Minneapolis. He's from Northfield. Get involved in LGBTQ rights at a local level. I want to get more into this in just a few minutes. And we have only until like 11:30, is that right?
Well, we started late, so, rental like 40.
Oh, sure. Okay, good. All right. So I'll come back on, right? Oh, I don't know. Okay. I'll come back to this one in a few minutes. Yeah. This one I've already mentioned to you as well. Uncover and tell the stories of LGBTQ people of faith in your faith communities, because these stories are the ones that we need in order to understand ourselves as a part of a long history of queer and trans ancestors. And our churches should be places where we learn these stories, like the story of the Eucharistic Catholic Church, or the story of the Metropolitan Community Church, which started the year before Stonewall in 1968, and was the largest grassroots movement of LGBTQ people in history. And the first building ever owned by an LGBTQ organization was the sanctuary of the MCC Church in Los Angeles, California. I mean, this is a remarkable story of faith and resilience and resistance to violence and oppression that we need as a church and we need as queer people. Developing trauma-aware care across intersecting identities and lifespans. One thing I just want you to hear, and we don't have time to get into this very, very deeply, but church, even affirming churches, churches that love and celebrate LGBTQ people, can still sometimes be hard places for queer and trans people to go when they've experienced some really traumatic, spiritually traumatic things in their upbringing. So just be sensitive to that fact and aware that LGBTQ people coming into your congregation, making this their home, is an act of bravery, even if you are an affirming congregation that embraces them, because you don't necessarily know what they bring with them from their spiritual religious past. Practicing a posture of compassionate curiosity to learn from queer and trans lives. My very first book was called Queer Lessons for Churches on the Straight and Narrow, which was a book that I wrote because I was so frustrated at being invited places to speak all the time and being asked to make a defense for why gay and lesbian Christians should be able to belong or should be able to be ordained or should be able to be married and all this sort of stuff. So I wrote this book to say, you know, churches could learn so much more about the life of faith if they looked at queer and trans lives curiously and compassionately and learned from those experiences. Experiences like the Eucharistic Catholic Church, like the MCC, like queer people who have been practicing faith at the margins of their churches and the communities and the denominations for generations. And then this is a really important one. I want you to try to take this question very seriously. What will you risk to protect LGBTQ lives in the coming season? And I'll show you what I mean with this slide here. This is the 2024 legislative session in the US. There were 559 anti-LGBTQ bills introduced in state legislatures across the US just last year. I don't know how many of them passed at this point, but in 2023, about the same number was introduced and 70 of them passed. 70 anti-LGBTQ laws in state legislatures across the country. And you can see Minnesota is in the darkest color. I mean, we had some of the highest number of anti-LGBTQ bills in the US last year. None of them passed, but they were introduced. You'll also see that North Dakota is not colored in there because the North Dakota legislature was off last year. They're an every other year legislature. So this year, you can expect North Dakota to be colored pretty darkly too. So we know, especially following the election that we just had, that LGBTQ people's rights and just abilities to live openly are going to be under attack even more in this coming session and in the coming 4 years. And this doesn't always just happen at the state legislative level. It also happens at the level of the city council in many towns or the school board in many towns. There are a number of don't say gay bills that have passed across the country that prohibit teachers in public schools from even naming the reality of LGBTQ people in the classroom, in curriculum, things of that nature. Yeah.
What are they like necessarily referring to by anti-LGBTQ bills?
Oh, that's a good question. It refers to a whole broad range of things. Some of them are like don't say gay bills where LGBTQ people are basically erased from the school curriculum. Some of them are laws that prohibit trans people from using the bathroom that aligns with their own gender or playing on sports teams. Some of them are, actually the majority of them at this point are typically anti-trans laws. So many of them have targeted trans people's access to health care. So for example, in many states like Texas, for example, a trans person cannot get the medical care they need for either hormone replacement therapy or gender affirmation surgery or anything of that sort. It's become illegal for doctors to provide that care in many states, including Texas. And I named Texas because I have a friend who's pastoring a church there, and their church decided the ministry they needed to start was helping trans people in their communities get from Texas to Colorado, because that's the next closest state to them where a trans person can get the medical care they need for their affirming their gender. I also recently spoke at a church, another church here in the Twin Cities, a really small Lutheran church in the little neighborhood of Minneapolis, who the pastor said, we have a new family in town. It's a mother and her daughter, and they just moved here from Florida. No job here, no family here. The daughter is trans, and the mother could not raise her in a state where she knew that her daughter was going to be discriminated against in her school system, not be able to get the health care that she needed as a trans adolescent. So they picked up from sunny Florida and moved to frigid Minnesota solely, exclusively because they could get the care that they needed here that they couldn't get in Florida. And in Florida, there's really not another state where you can move very closely that you could get that kind of health care. So Minnesota is one of the states where people are moving from all over the country right now because we have laws that protect trans people and allow for the provision of trans affirming care.
Yeah, just to reiterate that, Minnesota, I'm a trans person, so I follow laws very closely, but Minnesota is one of the states that has the best trans legislation, and even here as a trans person, I still have a lot of barriers. For instance, my dad is not affirming of me, and so one time for Christmas he wrote me a check, but to my dead name, which is the name I used before. I went by Pace. And the banks, even with my former social security card, my letter of name change decree and everything, refused to let me cash that check. And this was in Minnesota because the name on my present ID, even though I had my former ID with me and the proof of name change didn't match. So even in places like Minnesota, and as you can see with the bills being tracked, Minnesota's purple enough that there is a lot of fear among trans communities here that the protections we do have may not last much longer.
Yeah. So that's why it was such a big deal that there's, like a 50-50 split now in the legislature.
Cody,
Yeah.
you said something about 70 anti-LGBTQ bills. What was that again?
Passed in 2023.
Passed in 2023 where?
All across the country. Those are the state legislatures. And just to reiterate this point, Minnesota is the only place in the upper Midwest with trans affirming laws and protections. So people from the Dakotas, Nebraska, Iowa, Wisconsin pretty much have to either come to Minnesota or Illinois for the kind of care that they need. Other questions that you wanted to ask? So when I say, what are you going to risk in order to stand in solidarity with LGBT people, that's the kind of thing I mean. I mean, our rights, our protections, in many states, our very lives are under attack and under constant threat. And I hope that you can empathize and recognize the stress level that many LGBTQ people live with when they're living in all of our neighboring states, and even in Minnesota, I mean, there's a level of stress about whether these laws will be maintained and preserved. So what will you risk in order to stand in solidarity with LGBTQ people for our rights, our protections, our lives? I mentioned, so there was the 2023 laws. So the 70 laws included laws banning gender-affirming care for transgender youth, 15 laws requiring or allowing misgendering of trans youth, so laws that stipulate that the teacher in your school has to gender you based on your gender assigned at birth, even if you identify as like a trans man or trans woman. Laws targeting drag performances, laws creating license to discriminate, laws censoring school curriculum. So that's the kind of breakdown of what those 70 laws included. So I want you to know this organization, if you don't yet know it, Outfront Minnesota. It's one of the organizations that's doing a lot of the work at the state legislature level to advocate for laws that protect LGBTQ people in Minnesota. And they have a faith branch led by a friend of mine named Matt Llewellyn Otten. And their faith branch helps churches to know them. You know him?
Oh, yeah, from Westminster, a connection with Westminster.
Oh, yeah?
Presbyterian.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, in the past.
Yeah, he's a great guy. Methodist. He was educated at Boston University School of Theology and is from South Carolina. We never knew each other in South Carolina or Boston, but we've become friends here. So if you're interested in keeping track of what's going on, just get on the Outfront Minnesota website and sign up for their newsletter. And you'll get it in your email. It'll tell you what's happening at the state legislative level around LGBTQ rights. And if your church wants to get more involved, this is a place where you can do that. In fact, I just realized this. This is Scott Richardson. He's a pastor down in, rural southwest Minnesota. He's a Luther grad.
Worthington?
No, I'll think of it. Anyway, I've shown up for things that they've called us to at the State House before. It's always a really heartening time to be with other Christian communities, and usually Jewish and Muslim communities too, who are coming together to stand for and with LGBTQ people and our rights at the state level. So get on their website and sign up for their newsletter if you're interested in learning more about them. All right, it's 11:40, so we need to wrap it up. Any last statements or questions?
What's the last name of Transforming? Austin?
Hartke, Hartke.
Hartke.
Yeah. These are some of my books. And that's Austin Hartke's book there on the side. Hartke.
Justin Tanis is also local.
Yeah, Justin is a professor at United Theological Seminary. He and I are co-editing a book series together. James Brownson is just a really good biblical treatment of same-sex sexuality in the Bible. Gay Christian is similar, but except it's much more accessible.
And the Transforming has a new edition out, so I think the cover looks different than that now.
Oh, you're right.
In case you're looking for online, it doesn't match that.
And I thought I had my email address up here, but if you want to write it down, I'll give it to you. It's C. Sanders, Sanders, C. Sanders, 001 at Luther Sem, SEM.edu. And if you forget, just get on the Luther website, faculty profiles, and you can click on me and so I'll find my email address there. Glad to share any other resources you might find helpful. And I'm looking forward to being back in February.
And will these resources be show up on the recording? Do these resources come up on the recording? You've spoken about them, there's in your slides, so I'm hoping that.
If someone edits them in,
Yeah.
but or
hopefully they'll all
yeah.
be shown up, so if you forgot, you can.
Mhm.
Wow, thank you so much.